This week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist, we will be discussing Raising Hell, our second volume on secular parenting. And I'm Amit Pal, the Director of Communications for the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Liz Cavell, a constitutional attorney here at FFRF.
And I'm James Fettiplace, the Director of IT here at FFRF.
Now, secular parenting is a subject that's of concern to a lot of secular folks, free-thinking folks, and it's a topic we get a wide range of questions about. We have compiled a list on this topic that we will share with you today. And if you have additional questions for us, please comment right here on Facebook or email your question to askanatheist, all one word, no space, no hyphen, at ffrf.org. Again, askanatheist at ffrf.org. So first off, we'll tell you a little bit about ourselves, and we'll start with Liz.
Sure. So I'm Liz. I have two kids. I have sons, and my kids are very small. So my oldest son is not quite yet 3. He'll be 3 in a couple of months. And then I have a younger son who is about 15 months old. And my religious upbringing was Catholic, sort of a very traditional Italian-American, culturally Catholic, pretty committed, but not very pious, not weekly church going, but definitely participated in all the Catholic sacraments. I went to Catholic school early on. And I just sort of grew out of Catholicism like so many lapsed Catholics. Sure. And then, as I kind of did more of my own critical thinking and reading and just growing, I kind of realized I was an atheist, kind of unremarkably. Not a big transition or deconversion, but.
How about you, James?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in southern Wisconsin, and we didn't start out going to church, but then eventually we attended a United Methodist church, and later on, due to kind of changes in our family, we started also, we switched over to a Catholic church. And it was probably around 6th grade, I read a book of mythology, and it was just an epiphany for me that no one could tell me that one script or one scripture is more relevant or can be proven more than another one. And it also helped me kind of reconcile some contradictions between science and religion. And at one point, my parents asked me, do you believe? And my answer was no. And that was the end of the conversation, which is probably not the experience of a lot of people, but that was my experience. And so now I'm married, I'm a parent, a little bit different in that I'm a foster and adoptive parent, which comes with some of its own unique challenges when it comes to this. Yeah.
And how do you handle that, if I may ask?
Well, some of it is regulatory.
Sure.
So, for example, if a child is a foster child and comes to live in your home, and they're expected by their family or birth family to attend a religious service, it's required that we take them. And so even as an atheist, I would respected that,
sure,
the decision of the birth families.
Certainly.
And what their religious and cultural backgrounds were. And so I've taken kids to church.
Sure, yeah. Well, my religious background is quite different from your Liz's or your James. And if I may dare say, from most of our viewers, I'm Hindu. I've been raised Hindu. My family wasn't, there's a big divergence, let me put it that way. My father was not at all religious, very hands-off. My mother, on the other hand, is. And she tried to raise us religious, but then a literal distance from her gave my brother and I, who's as non-believing as I am, if not more, in a manner of speaking, distance from her when it came to religion. Because both my brother and I were in boarding school from a very early age, And so we used to go home only during the vacations, so she had less time to work on us, so to speak. And over time, I just became more and more skeptical, especially seeing the guardians of the religion, Hindu priests, and how ridiculous they were in their way of thinking, in just their approach to everything, made me, I remember at the age of 6, 7, thinking to myself that if these are the protectors of Hinduism, then Hinduism ain't that great, basically. And I have 2 daughters, 15 and 12, older than your children, Liz. And we've raised them to be very secular. My mother, when she comes over from India, tries to sort of, sneak sort of religion in. She got a copy of the Gita, which is the Hindu holy book, for my older one, and she keeps on asking her if she's read it or not. And my daughter just sort of, smiles and says nothing. So there's a process of negotiation that we have, sure, and it's worked fairly well so far. So I guess, we'll dive into the questions that we have gotten. The first one is by Christina Henry, who asks, my husband's family is extremely religious, and it secretly baptized our son without my permission and said it was harmless, in quotation marks. They don't understand why I'm so upset. How can I tell them that what they did was completely unacceptable and that they need to stop trying to force religion on my kids? Why don't you both answer that? And then, of course, I have a very different perspective on that. Then, you both do.
So I kind of have mixed feelings about this one because, well, we discussed we're all kind of in a little bit different of places with parenting. Sure. And I'm definitely at the beginning of the journey where my, sure, kids were very recently infants. Sure. They are not baptized, yeah, to my knowledge. Yeah. But I do have a very devout Catholic grandmother who is very open about her opinions on my choices regarding religion, and at every chance she gets, definitely remarks on what a shame and a scandal it is that my kids aren't baptized. Wow. And I'm not the only one in the family, sure, obviously, of sure, my generation. Sure. But so I kind of feel like I almost can see why it's harmless when you're talking about an infant. Yeah. But I can see why it's also just a slap in the face, because it's a remark. It's a gesture of sort of disrespect to your choices, your parenting choices. Sure. But I have a little bit of empathy, not for my grandma in particular, because her approach is not very, doesn't inspire empathy, but other people who genuinely are, I'm respectful of what you believe, but I so deeply believe that if your baby dies, they're going to hell, and I'm tormented by that thought. And so I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this when we're talking about an infant. Yeah. If someone tried to baptize my 3-year-old son, who's incredibly verbal and incredibly curious, and then left me to explain what the heck that all was about, I would be absolutely irate. Yeah. And really, I think, direct and confrontational. I'm having a hard time knowing how I would react to a secret baptism of my newborn. By a genuinely tormented Christian.
No, it's a difficult question. James, your perspective?
Yeah, it is definitely a difficult conversation, but I would personally encourage them to speak with the family members who basically did that behind their back.
Right.
This is completely undermining their role as parents, in my opinion, and also asserting that their belief system is essentially dominant over what your own belief systems are as a parent of your own child. And that act is a certain kind of bigotry, really, to say that their belief system simply overrides yours, even though you are the parent of that child. I think that there's a certain amount of arrogance that might be embedded in that decision. That they don't trust your ability to raise a child in the way that you've chosen. So what I would encourage someone to do is to immediately have a conversation with those family members, say exactly how you feel about it, that you believe that in the same words as the question, like what you did was unacceptable. If you do something like this again, you are going to harm our relationship, and I don't want that to happen.
Yeah, I agree that it'd be really important, I think, no matter like the empathy that I felt and maybe could express, I understand that you deeply and truly believe that this is what's best for my child. But, you know, here's why this is just so inappropriate, and here's why I'm so hurt.
Right.
But I do think a really important thing is to not let it slide and just say it's harm in the sense that it's harmless. It's not even worth it. I'm not even going to bring it up. I'm just going to like fume and just who cares, because that is definitely the creeping, you know, intrusion of other people's religious beliefs being sort of foisted onto your parenting decisions, and it will happen again in some other way, shape, or form. It will sort of invite people that their perspectives on this topic are welcome and that they're part of the decision making. And so I think it's important not to let it slide.
Agreed. And you could come from a place of curiosity and ask, I'm really curious, why did you feel that this was so important that you would do this without my consent? I think that might be an approach that you could take. If the response is, well, it's harmless anyway, that's not really an answer.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be a satisfactory answer for me anyway. I would want to keep asking curious questions. And I would agree that compassion is absolutely necessary. And at the same time, that, you know, compassion needs to be a two-way street there too. That there needs to be compassion for how you feel as a parent. Personally, I would have less concerns about the religious overtones of the act, more about my parenting being undermined.
Right.
Well, I come at this again from a different background and perspective, and there is no exact equivalent of a baptism ceremony in Hinduism. There's a coming of age ceremony, and when we were discussing this show, I had this hunch that Hinduism is as patriarchal, if not more, than other religions, and so it's, wait for this, only for boys. So that's the reason now I know when I checked it up online that my mother didn't hassle us to get anything done for the girls. So we didn't have to sort of, have any sort of dialogue or debate about that. Having said that, of course, I agree with both of you, Liz and James, that there needs to be a back and forth and give and take on that, and to let somebody, any relative who does this sneakily, to let them know that that's not appropriate in a polite enough and non-confrontational way, possibly, but still, there does need to be a dialogue on that. Next question is from Amy Mercer. A common response when a loved one dies is from believing folks that, quote unquote, they are in a better place now, or again in quotation marks, they're watching over you. How do you explain the concept of death to your kids, and especially at younger ages? Liz, you have real young ones. Have you broached that at all?
So we have not had to really deal with this issue yet in a really concrete, awful way. But definitely my 3-year-old, like I said, very verbal. He knows and has heard like the word dead. But it's so abstract, and they're so in the literal world at that age that I really find that while I get why you would shield your kids or why it's so complex, it's like, I don't even want to explain this to you. I still think the things that are reached for by, believing people, like they're watching over you or they're in a better place, I actually really don't, now that I have a 3-year-old living in my house, I just don't see how that would be helpful. Just anything with metaphor is just so unhelpful in communicating with my kid.
I hadn't thought of it from that perspective.
You know what I mean? Like, it's not, because it's, well, Grammy's gone now, but she's still watching over you. She's in a place. It's in the sky. It's a metaphor. My kid's just like, oh, the sky. I know about the sky. Why is she up where the planes are? Could we take a plane there? It's not helpful to be like, here's some metaphors to help you understand this really abstract concept, 3-year-old. So to me, my plan is to try and be as simplistic but sort of factual, not cold, but factual about trying to explain what it is
Sure.
to be dead and the permanence and the fact how it relates to the life cycle. And,
Sure. Right.
it's just, I'm not looking forward to it,
Yeah.
but I'm not, sort of lamenting the fact like, oh, we're not religious, so I can't use all those metaphors,
Yeah.
because I really haven't found metaphor a particularly helpful parenting tool. James?
I would agree with that. As a foster and adoptive parent, again, we have had school-age children primarily, so ages 5 to 17. And so again, if that question were to come up and it was a foster child, the first thing we would need to do, of course, is check in with the birth family and make sure that we're accommodating their belief system and their cultural perspective on it. Now, with our adoptive child, this did come up because my mother passed away, and he did have a relationship with her, as a grandmother in a sense. So it was already kind of established for him that he's already kind of a non-believer on his own. So when we talked about it, it was an easier conversation, I think, than the first time it were to come up. It has come up with pets, though, as well. That I think is a pretty common thing for a lot of families when a favorite pet might pass away or something like that. I think it's less important exactly what you say, and it's more important that you're bringing your direct attention, undivided attention to children when the topic of death or something difficult like that comes up. I think it's too easy for us in this day and age to be easily distracted by a lot of things, and especially if you have a lot of children, it's you're trying to meet everybody's needs at the same time. But again, with this kind of serious topic, making sure as a parent that you're just being as compassionate as possible, that you're even getting down to their level, so that you're not above them, all those kind of standard techniques to be able to have a conversation. And if they feel sad about somebody passing, like to not try to push that down, like make sure that you're exploring those feelings, that those feelings are going to change from moment to moment. Just all of those things I think that, again, I think are more important than necessarily the really literal kind of description of things, as you were saying.
Right.
Like if you were saying somebody is like in heaven, I know that as a child, I would, again, think of something very literal, like something in the clouds, as you were saying, or something like that. Where is that? To me, that's kind of a slippery slope, especially if you're a free thinker, non-believer, or atheist, however you want to describe that. That it's better to stick to what you've experienced. And to listen. So I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, just building on something James said kind of really struck me, which is sort of the really acknowledging and allowing a child to sort of feel their feelings, which is sad. And as we've all experienced death and losing loved ones, it's just sad and it sucks and it's awful and they're gone and you miss them and that's it. And sort of allowing this is something I really love about parenting, from a non-religious perspective, is that like nothing's really in the way. I found it confusing as a child to sort of have to see this like silver lining, and it's almost this like greatness, dying is like essentially like the greatest thing ever if you really are a true, believer, at least in Christianity. It's like you're now gonna just, be in heaven living the ultimate paradise with God and whatever. Obviously, I didn't pay attention in Sunday school, but the point is, I didn't go to Sunday school. But the point is, I love being free to sort of just, let my kids feel things that are natural and going through that with them. And sometimes, I'm not looking forward to it, but it's part of it is just, it's sad when the people we love die, and it's permanent and it's awful, and I don't think any of that sort of they're in a better place or they're in heaven or they're with Jesus is really helpful or comforting, and and kind of getting that out of the way so you can actually really be comforting and empathetic with your kids' feelings, I think is really freeing.
Yeah, and I agree to take that a little bit further when you're talking about an afterlife. Instead, we choose to focus on this life and how precious
absolutely
and this lifetime is. That we get one chance. I think we mentioned kind of the cycle of life. We think of life as basically a flowering. Like we have our time to flower here, and then we pass, just like every other form of life. And I agree. I think that might actually be easier as a as an atheist than it might be if you were trying to explain these really abstract concepts to children.
Right.
So I was fortunate twice over. I didn't have to suffer the loss of a loved one when I was a child. 3 of my grandparents actually passed away maybe in the last decade or so.
Wow.
One of them in college. And then with my children, just like you, Liz, when they were very young, fortunately, we didn't have to suffer the loss of a near and dear one. My father and father-in-law both passed away within a year of each other. But that was when the kids were, the older one was 11, 12, and the younger one was 8, 9. And I felt that they were old enough to understand the concept of death. Maybe I was taking too much for granted. And hence, we didn't have to sort of hem and haw and sort of try to skirt around the edges.
Right.
So that, in that sense, at least, it worked out well. Yeah.
Great.
Next question. Some would argue, Don Esser asks, that you're indoctrinating your children into a different belief system, which is basically a religion. How would you respond to that? And that's a question we often get from non-sympathetic folks. So, Liz and James. Liz?
What do you think, James?
Well, we have to think about that word, indoctrination. What does that really mean? And if you look into the definition of that word, that means teaching uncritically a concept or belief system. In our household, we don't do that. We focus on building critical thinking skills along with other things like compassion. So we are literally not indoctrinating anyone. So so that is in a way it's not really a dodge. It's really the truth. We give our kids opportunities to think for themselves and come to their own conclusions. Whatever might be age relevant and things like that is taken into consideration. But so by that, we're not doing the same thing that might be done in religious families.
Yeah, I think it might maybe sometimes is imagined by whatever euphemism you just gave for trolls. It might be imagined that, like, we're sitting our kids down and sort of telling them, like, oh, you heard about Jesus at school today? Well, let me tell you. It's all BS, and Jesus isn't real, and all the people that believe that are idiots. And really, like, I don't know any, parents who are doing a secular approach, and certainly we aren't doing this in our household. Parents who are, actively teaching their children, like, atheism, or how to react to different belief systems that they might come in contact with, but rather like sort of trying to teach them what the tools are to evaluate information of all stripes, not just religious, or supernatural claims. And so that's my goal, at least as a parent, is to raise kids who are curious and who are, who can think really critically and who can kind of make up their own minds about what to believe and who to be. And I think, it's not a very useful analogy to indoctrinating into a religion, which and the difference is, speaking to someone who asks you that question, I would just sort of describe what in my mind are the differences. I mean, I was raised in Catholicism, and we've already established I wasn't taught very much about what the belief system was, but I did go to Catholic school, and so there was an element to it of just, take out your religion textbooks and turn to page this, and this is true, and Jesus did that, and when you die, this happens. Just being told what is true and what to believe and what's accepted and what's not accepted, and that's a really different experience, having had that experience as a child, that's really different from what James is describing.
And I agree. And I had similar experiences growing up in both the United Methodist and Catholic, especially in Catholicism, in that there are a lot of rituals that I didn't understand, and nobody really explained to me. You were just supposed to do it.
Right.
And that's definitely not what we do at our home. If we ask one of our kids to do something and they say why, we're going to answer that question. We're not going to say, well, just because, unless it's why as a response to every single answer, and then there's no end to it.
Right.
We might be like cut out that conversation at that point, right?
There is no why, honey.
Practical.
It's the great unanswerable why.
Right. But generally speaking, in terms of atheism, I mean, we don't really have any similar practices, I guess you would say, in terms of you are expected to believe this, you are not to question it. I can't say that that's true for all religions or, for all different Christian denominations, but it's certainly an aspect that people are being indoctrinated. So I guess kind of turn that question right back on its head, like, no, we're not really indoctrinating anyone. It's very different than growing up in a religious household. Yeah. And there are advantages to that as a parent.
I would second or third that, especially as a harried parent of two young ones, one a teenager, one almost. I mean, I just don't have the time or the patience to indoctrinate them into anything. I mean, you're basically just trying to teach them basic values, basic values of empathy and science and sharing and caring. And beyond that, it's too hard, too much work.
Right, exactly.
Simon Montoya, next question, wants to know, by raising your children without religion, kids miss the community aspect of church and or other religions and the feeling of being a part of something bigger. Many volunteering opportunities, as we all know, are for religious organizations. Then the question arises, is raising children without religion worth it? Good question. Liz?
That is a good question. And I do think a lot of people are troubled by this or motivated by this to stay at least tangentially involved somehow in church and religion. But I do think one of the things I would challenge, well, in a word, is it worth it still to raise your kids in religion? No, I don't think so. I don't think the trade-offs are worth that. And it's not necessary, because I think it's sort of it's a fallacy to sort of say that raising your kids, just sort of outside of any religion is means that they're missing being part of something greater. I think if anything, one of the things James said that sort of made me think of this was talking about the life cycle and death, and thinking of yourself as sort of like a flowering plant, and we'll experience life just like all these other forms of life, and that sort of thinking about life and about who we are and how we fit into the greater everything. I think there's so many opportunities to have those conversations with your kids just in a natural way, and in talking about the natural world, and that's leaving aside all the greater things that you can make your child feel a part of that have just to do with humanity. Their community, their school community.
Sure. Oh, yeah, there are plenty. Of other opportunities.
There's so many bigger things bigger than your kids and things bigger than your family that you can really actively teach your children that we are a part of, and that I think present so many more opportunities for teaching values than necessarily just, we belong to this group of people who believe this thing, and that's what makes us all in this in group. I mean, there's a limit to that, and I think I like the opportunities in the secular realm better for teaching your kids belonging.
James?
This is something that comes up again as a foster and adoptive parent. There are some differences in that church can be an important way for other religions. The ceremonies and meeting together Yeah, there are important community aspects to that we absolutely respect when we're fostering a child. For our children who are not foster kids, and there are conversations about how they want to participate or not. If they choose not to participate, I don't see that as an absence of something. So that's kind of how that question is typically worded, is like, is it worth it to have them raised without religion? What's implied in that statement is they're missing out on something. And as a parent, it's important, of course, to be in a family. It's important to be part of a community. You can't be isolated. You have to be part of a community. What I think is more important is to be very intentional about how you participate in your community or communities. A lot of us have, and I think of it as communities as a pluralistically, because most of us are not just a member of a community. We're members of multiple communities. And I have done volunteer work that quite often is usually kind of sponsored by like a church or a synagogue or something like that. And so, I've served meals and washed dishes in homeless shelters, shoulder to shoulder with people who are Christians, who are of the Jewish faith. And I think that is actually pretty important for us to all work together, to accept and to value our differences, and to build bridges across those differences. And one way to do that is through participating in these volunteer events. So I don't think it necessarily has to be something where you're like, well, this is sponsored by this church. We're a secular family. We're not going to do that. I have a different approach to that. I think it's important to get out there in the community and show people that if you're atheist, that doesn't make you abnormal. That you're just another community member to be valued just along with everyone else, and that we can show through example that we're just as compassionate and active in our communities as anyone else.
I would completely agree with what both of you are saying. I mean, my older one volunteers on a regular basis, and there's no shortage of non-religious groups to be found. At the same time, for example, just to give an example from my background, Indian American gatherings are often held, the community centers are within the temple. So, you go for that, so you don't necessarily have to partake in the religious aspect. Both my girls learn Indian classical dance. There is a religious element to it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're engaging in worship as such. So you pick and choose and sort of, be eclectic, so to speak, and, that's how you get through it. And plus, there are lots of secular organizations out there that offer an alternative community, plural communities, as James said, to religious organizations. Next question, which is a touching one. Hazel Meyer emails us to ask, my daughter has been in and out of hospital since she was a toddler. How do you deal with chronic illness when people are always telling her that they're praying for her and that God will keep her morale up? That's again a good question, very touching, pretty much tragic. How do you sort of respond to that?
This is hard, James.
It is hard. First, very sorry to hear about your daughter. I'm very sorry to hear that. That has to be incredibly difficult. And on top of it, to have friends or family or things like that who are not accommodating or understanding the differences that you might have in terms of your belief system. I like to think of it this way, that a lot of times when people are offering their prayers, thoughts and prayers and things like that, it's maybe their way of trying to show their compassion, that they care, that however, I think what might be more helpful, because that's got to be very difficult as a huge burden, as a parent, is if they're willing to pray for you, perhaps maybe they're also willing to pitch in. So an example would be, maybe there's a day in the week where they could cook a meal for you. Maybe they could help you with transportation to the hospital or something like that.
You need all the help you can get at that, in such a situation,
Right, and also kind of embedded in that question is that you might not, it's difficult to have a morale if you're not a believer.
Sure.
I wouldn't agree with that. I think some of the the happiest people and high morale people that I know are not necessarily believers. So I would think that's kind of a myth in a sense. But what would help my morale is to know that people care about me, and they care about our family, and they're willing to help when we ask for help.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think when I try to think of myself in that awful situation, and then on top of it dealing with like the million thoughts and prayers on Facebook, and how just in agony I would already be, and how like that would make me so extra angry because of the circumstances. I think James's idea is sort of a really, better than my flying off the handle on Facebook, non-confrontational way of responding to that by saying, thank you for that, but here's, what would be really helpful. It's sort of a way of kind of confronting that, and also maybe getting something that would be useful to you in a really hard time.
Right, and just assuming that, let's say that someone is a Christian and they're saying that they're sending their prayers. One might go back to that belief system, be like, well, Christianity is based on the idea of sacrifice. So maybe you're willing to sacrifice some of your time to help us in a very direct way, because putting thoughts and prayers into a Twitter or Facebook feed that's not really giving us something tangible that we can work with in our family. You really want to show like that you're part of our community and want to help out. Be great if you could make us a meal.
That's an interesting way to approach it, James. I'm personally more forgiving. Fortunately, neither of my girls have had any bad health episodes, but I had an intense one some years ago. I was in the ICU on the ventilator for a good number of days. And when I was recovering, there was all that flood of thoughts and prayers, and I approached it the way James was describing, that, hey, at least, they're, thinking of me, caring for me. And then, people locally did help out. So, all well and good. You don't necessarily agree with them, but I feel at that juncture, it's difficult to take them on and say, hey, look, why the hell are you even sort of,
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So wonderful questions that we had in advance. Now we have a couple of questions that you all have sent us while you've been watching the show. So let me take a look and see. So Hollis Evan Ramsey asks us, I'm in favor of adding philosophy to the countrywide public school system. What do you think about that, Liz?
Jeez.
I know that's a deep question.
So many priorities of things to add to the public education system. I don't know what I think of that specific proposal, but I do think it might really be useful to engage with kids, especially at a young age, a little bit more directly about critical thinking skills, logic. Philosophy is sort of really tied in with logical thinking. I don't think that could hurt, because I think a lot of what makes kind of sustains religion in the minds of adults who are critical thinkers in every other area of their lives is the suspension of logic, the ability to see or to allow for sort of illogical patterns of thinking. So I could see the value in that. I don't know, again, I'm not like steeped yet in the school age stuff, so I don't know how
You'll soon be.
How deficient and what priorities I will be kind of focused on that are missing. But I don't remember having any sort of philosophy exposure, especially as a young school age person.
I was later on in high school, but not in
a
middle
little
or
bit in
elementary.
high school.
Yeah, I would imagine. And I don't think my girls have had any sort of philosophy classes as far as I can remember. So,
right. Well, I think of philosophy as the love of wisdom. So,
Sure.
I would agree that it's important to have that concept, the love of wisdom, as part of school, and not to be to counter that anti-intellectualism that kind of has comes up repeatedly in the United States.
Sure.
So yeah.
Talking of kids and school, really interesting question that's more personal. My husband and I have had a hard time explaining to our children why other kids are trying to convert them at school. Any suggestions?
This is hard, and haven't had to deal with it yet. Have you, James?
No, I haven't had that come up.
This being Madison?
Right. It might be the bubble of Madison. It could be. But I know that if that conversation did arise, and maybe it will at some point, and a child is having trouble because their friends were trying to convert them or something like that, again, I think it's really just important as a parent to have a conversation with your kid. Ask more questions and listen more than talk, I think, at that point. If they found it like personally hurtful or something like that, that they feel ostracized because they're a non-believer, that's a really important conversation to have with your kid.
Yeah.
Being from a non-Christian background, even I don't recall, you're right, maybe we are lucky, it's Madison.
Yeah.
Either of my girls ever mentioning that somebody else tried to convert them. They have friends who are religious, but there's never been that notion of you're on a false path and I need to show you the light. But even in Madison, something that happened to me, not quite to me, dental office, these two kids, their mother is getting a dental checkup. They approached this other woman. We are sitting together almost. They thought maybe I was too heathenish and too foreign, and they literally are screaming at her. Have you found Jesus? Have you been saved? It was the most weird thing, one of the most weird things I've ever witnessed in the past many years, really. And then that lady asks them, "Are you homeschooled?" And they say yes. And she sort of sarcastically says, "Why am I not surprised?" So anyway, so yeah, that was really bizarre, and that happened in Madison. Yeah, so I was
just when
totally,
you thought the dentist couldn't get more awful.
Yeah, so I was completely taken aback. The next question you get is from Phil Monroe. Where does one draw the line on our kids, participating in religious activities like Easter, Christmas, etc.? We've gone a bit over that, but yeah, let's go ahead.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about Easter, Christmas is kind of like a whole nother issue of like, hey, how do you deal with this as a secular parent? So I've definitely got opinions on that. Kids participating in religious activities, where I thought you were going with that question is like your daughter's doing the Indian dance and it's sort of a religious activity, but you know, it's sort of an extracurricular thing that they want to participate in. And I kind of have the attitude you do about that in terms of what your girls are doing. When it comes to, you know, how do we deal with participating in religious, you know, holidays and the secular components, so far my philosophy is really just I partake, my partner and I, of whatever sort of tangential pagan traditional nonsense we damn well please. So if it's fun and it's like,
absolutely.
and there's a way to sort of have it playing pretend, we partake of it. We have already our 3-year-old, we cannot shield from the concept of like Santa. Like without our input whatsoever, he like knows who Santa is, like he recognizes him on like merchandise, like, so, you know, we just kind of like roll with the fun stuff. And to me, like this is such like the ultimate secular parent debate, which is like, it's a lie. And it's like this indoctrinating thing that we're also vehemently against. Like, to me, the big difference with Santa and religion is, for me, I won't be forcing my kids to believe in Santa when their critical thinking skills outdevelop their ability to believe in him. So, therefore, you know, everything in my kid, he's 3, everything in his life is so on the border of imagination and reality. It doesn't, you know, yes, I try to be really direct with him and be really literal and, you know, tell him what things are when he asks me. But at the same time, he's 3 and his world is awesome and everything is imaginative, and the line between reality and just fantasy
Fantasy.
is so blurry, and that's what makes his life awesome. I mean, all we're ever doing is pretending things, and it's and it's nonsense, and it's supernatural, and it's not real. But I try not to be too uptight as a secular parent about my 3-year-old, thinking he's a dragon, or saying we're all,
Obviously, he's at that
I don't
age.
correct him and say,
Yeah.
well, honey, I know we're playing, but it's important that we're not really dragons. It's all just
Sure.
fine.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
gonna become a critical thinker.
Yeah.
I'm gonna allow him to develop away from believing in Santa instead of saying, no, I see your doubts, but trust me, it's true because this. It's just fun. We play pretend. We do gift exchanges.
Sure.
I don't emphasize the Santa is really doing this, and the other
Sure.
thing, but we just kind of go with it and do the fun stuff. We do an egg hunt, and there's a man dressed in a bunny costume, and isn't that fun? And
Right.
it's all pagan anyway.
Agreed. I mean, there's religion and culture, the big overlap between those things. And so we participate in things that are common to what we learned in our cultural community, and one of those for us was, Santa Claus and Christmas and Easter with the Easter bunny. I remember having, in our family, we had a tradition of getting a new pair of shoes on Easter. And on Easter morning, we would wake up and then the new pair of shoes would be under the bed full of candy, and that the Easter bunny brought, that. What's wrong with that? I mean, that's one of my best memories, I think, of finding that new pair of shoes under our bed with candy in it. I don't have a problem with that as a non-believer.
Yeah, where does that conflict with your lack of religious? What on earth does that have to do with anybody's religious beliefs whatsoever?
Yeah,
I mean, when my friends ask me, sort of critically, well, you're an atheist, but do you celebrate Christmas? What do you do? This is troubling me. It's I don't mean to be defensive, but what do you do at Christmas that so revolves around the birth of Jesus? Nothing.
Exactly.
We do nothing. Same as you. We decorate a tree. We do all manner of pagan-inspired, fun seasonal things. We exchange gifts. My kid's understanding of Santa is not rooted in the religious. Nothing. We do the same thing that a lot of people that are culturally celebrating the phenomenon of these holidays do. And it's fun. And we'll let our kids grow out of it at some point, which I think is the key.
Right.
I mean, my approach always has been that of an Indian American organization that was planning a major Indian festival. They were like, how do we do this in a secular way? So as to not alienate people who aren't that devout or that religious. And exactly, so you can sort of partake of that without necessarily having to sort of, be hymnal or ultra devout or, whatever. And, that's the way we do it, basically, from Christmas to Diwali, which is the Hindu festival of lights, to just a whole range of stuff. We do it, but prayers are not necessarily a part of that.
Right.
So final question, let me pull it up. So Nyla Vance asks us, and it's a good question to end the program on, what books would you recommend to introduce children to religion or critical thinking? Or James?
Well, I happen to be a big fan of mythology ever since I picked up a book on mythology and just found it, I just enjoyed it quite a bit. I just don't enjoy reading, but mythology just really triggered something for me. So I have a lot of collections of mythology, and we had a ritual for a long time, for any children in our home, at bedtime. Bedtime has to be really regimented when you're a foster adoptive parent, something you learn. We always read at bedtime. And so I just recommend kind of collections of mythology because they're interesting, they're fun. It, of course, depends upon their age level and what they can, what they can accept. So you got to review it first. But I really like delving into collections of works that are around a theme. for example, like creation myths, because then that can also lead to more questions, and
Right.
you can, and then that's an opportunity to work on those critical thinking skills. So I don't necessarily have a favorite book that's like, this is how you can teach critical thinking skills to a kid. I think it's more about like being intentional about what you're reading with your kids, to participate in that reading. I think reading to kids is just an essential part of growing up now that I've done it. And then to encourage questions, encourage curiosity, encourage critical thinking when it comes to that. And it's a great way to show that like not everybody believes the same thing, and that's okay.
Right. I think the collections, we're not here yet necessarily with our kids, although I will just second and third, and obviously this is nothing new, like social science tells us this is the most important thing ever, but reading to your kids, just anything. Our kid who's 3, he's so verbal and he's so curious, and it's so amazing how much reading before bed, just a little bit before bed every night, since he was an older infant, has just given him so much context, and it's expanded his world so much. And, when he confronts something that he's curious about in the real world, it's always, that's just like Peter Rabbit and what happened in this. And it's just like, you're definitely like, you're building the whole like critical thinking, and the whole just kind of reality of your kid, just by reading whatever and giving them a frame of reference. But I know that there are secular parents out there who are like, hey, I'm looking for actual secular kids books, and there are both books on secular parenting, but also secular books, children's books written from a secular perspective, including Dan Barker's book.
Yes. And I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on that, because it's a Freedom from Religion Foundation show. And so our co-president, Dan Barker, has written a couple of books. He's written many books, including Free Will Explained, that has just come out a couple of months ago, but a number of books directed toward children and adolescents. And I'd recommend all of them. There are 3 of them. Just Pretend is the first one. Maybe Yes, Maybe No, and Maybe Right, Maybe Wrong.
Right.
So all of these are wonderful books that we'd highly recommend to our viewers, to our members. And, I think they offer an alternative perspective on how to raise your children without religion. And after all, we are the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Well, thank you so much, Liz. And thank you so much, James.
Thank you.
And that's all for today. An important message at the end. If you'd like to sign up to receive action alerts from FFRF, please text FFRF for Freedom from Religion Foundation to 52886. Again, FFRF to 52886. Data rates may apply. Thank you for joining us here on Ask an Atheist. We'll be taking a break next week and re-airing a classic movie from 1980, A Second Look at Religion. As always, if you have ideas for a show, please comment or email at, again, the email address is askanatheist, one word, no space, no hyphen, at ffrf.org. Askanatheist at ffrf.org. Thank you so much, and see you soon.